All right, hello. My name's Andrea, or Drea for short. Today is Saturday, October 3rd, 2020, and this is episode 3 of the Drea's Hook podcast. If you're watching here live on Instagram, welcome. If you're catching the replay on IGTV, welcome. And if you're watching the replay on YouTube, welcome. So we have a lot to talk about today, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get into it. Make sure that I'm waving at people as we go along here. So first, before I get into projects that I'm actively working on, I wanted to do a little announcement / plug for THREADFOLIO. So THREADFOLIO is a website that's being created by Chain 2 Crochet. Her name is Shell, and it is a platform to sell and buy patterns. So not just crochet and knitting patterns, but also sewing and macrame. So the past couple of weeks, there have been payments available on the website. It takes a lot of work to get a website to a place where you're able to start accepting payments. So if you are a designer looking for somewhere to sell your patterns, definitely check THREADFOLIO out. If you are a fiber artist who likes to buy patterns, definitely check it out as well. So I just wanted to briefly talk about, I do have 2 patterns currently listed on THREADFOLIO. So first is my Drea drawstring bag, which is actually free on THREADFOLIO, and it will be free on THREADFOLIO forever, and THREADFOLIO is the only place you can get it. So definitely check that out. If you're on Instagram, the link is in my bio. If you're watching this on YouTube, the link will be down in the description box below. And the other pattern, which is a premium pattern, is my brick house pillow pattern, which I love. So if you are looking for some patterns, definitely check those out. But yeah, I encourage everybody to give THREADFOLIO a try. I think it's good that there is another option out there to sell patterns in light of everything that's been happening in the community lately with the website that we usually use. And I think that it's really productive rather than kind of focusing on the negative aspects of that situation to support efforts to try to do something a little different. So definitely be sure to check out THREADFOLIO. It's very user-friendly, very intuitive, not complicated at all, and it's accessible. So definitely be sure to check that out. All right, so now we're just going to get into some of my whips that I'm working on. So the first one, I didn't get to talk about it last week. This is the Soundwave shawl designed by Stephanie Aaron. The yarn that I'm using, the main color is After the Rain by LaRue Cotton, and this is actually Tencel yarn, which is another type of plant fiber. And then the mohair stripes that we have in between are by Sorella yarn, and this is the colorway Voyager. So I have a little progress keeper. So this stitch marker shows where I was the last time I talked about it, which was on episode 1. So if you want to hear more about the project, definitely be sure to check out episode 1. So I've done it quite a bit since then. Let me see, I think this is about 3 or 4 rows. So definitely making some progress. And I have to say, this is absolutely my favorite project to work on at the moment. Like, it's just so relaxing, and I love seeing it come together. So every time it comes up on my little rotation of projects to work on, because I try to work on a different project every day for the most part. I didn't really stick to that this week, but that's neither here or there. Anyway, but every time that this project comes up, I just get so excited about it. So I did have a little bit of a frogging incident last week. So if you're not aware, mohair is kind of notorious for being really difficult to frog. It tends to kind of get caught on itself. So I had realized while I was working on my mohair row that I had actually I think added an extra stitch on the previous row. So like I needed to frog the mohair and then frog about half of the previous row. So thankfully I wasn't too far into the row when I realized that I needed to frog the mohair. It was only about 30 or 40 stitches. But I did have a little bit of snagging, but it was okay. It wasn't nearly as bad as I was expecting it to be. I did end up having to cut a little bit of the yarn towards the end because like I just didn't have the patience for it, but I saved like 95% of the yarn. So that was my first experience frogging mohair, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, but it was not as easy as frogging other types of yarns. And I think that if it had been like a larger, I guess, area of mohair that I needed to frog, it might have caused some issues. But yeah, that's basically all that we have going on the Soundwave shawl. I'm really excited to finish this one because it's just gorgeous. And it's getting pretty large already because you're increasing by quite a few stitches per row. So it's growing in width pretty quickly. So it's going to be a very large fingering weight shawl, and I'm so excited to finish it. All right. Hi, Luke. I did not acknowledge you. He's like sitting 10 feet away from me. So he's been like glaring at me this entire time because I didn't say hi to him. If you don't know, Luke is my fiance. So if it ever seems like I'm being particularly mean to him, that's just how we function as a couple. So don't be alarmed. I'm not being mean to a random stranger. All right. So the next project that I wanted to talk about is no more, but I'll just go ahead and show you the yarn that I was using. So this was the Loveland shawl by TL Yarn Crafts, and it's a Tunisian crochet shawl. And when I talked about it in episode 1, I had made quite a bit of progress on it, but something that I wasn't happy about is I don't think that I was putting the last stitch of each row in the correct spot, so that when you looked at it, you could see like a kind of gap between like the second to last stitch and the last stitch, and it just kind of like carried on through the entire inside of the shawl. And I just wasn't really a fan of that. So I decided that I was going to frog it and start over. And so I did frog it twice actually, and I was still getting the same thing happening. And I've kind of adopted a rule for myself. I don't always stick to it, but something that I try to do is I will, if I'm having trouble with something, whether it's like a project as a whole or like a particular stitch or technique, it's kind of like a 3 strikes you're out type of deal. So like I'll attempt it 3 times, and if it's still not working, then I'll just go ahead and set it to the side, because I think that that's like a good balance between, you know, actually like persevering and trying to learn and not sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought, and not like sticking with something for so long that like you're just not being productive and not making any progress. So 3 strikes you're out. So I frogged it 2 more times after that, and it still wasn't looking the way that I wanted it to. So I just decided that the project was going to be put in timeout. And then after I did that, I kind of did some thinking. So did I actually talk about the yarn? Okay, so this is LaRue cotton. The colorway is called Rusted, and this is the DK cotton yarn. So it's 100% Pima cotton. So it was going to be a DK weight shawl, which isn't particularly heavy, but like I have found over the past few weeks that I'm really starting to develop a strong preference for fingering weight shawls. So the Dancing in the Sun wrap that I finished last week, I really love that one, and I'm planning on making another one. And then Soundwave shawl that I just talked about is also fingering weight. And then I'm working on another shawl called the Party Punch shawl by TL Yarn Crafts, and that's also fingering weight. So 3 fingering weight shawls, and I just absolutely love how light and airy they are. And so that kind of got me to thinking. I was like, would I really like a DK weight shawl? It would definitely be a little bit heavier, and the shawl is like a pretty large portion of the shawl is in Tunisian knit stitch, which is definitely kind of it makes a thicker fabric. So it's not like it's a lace or like a mesh where it would be more open and more light. Like it would be like a pretty dense fiber. So I'm thinking it would be pretty heavy. And I live in Houston and we have very mild, almost non-existent winters here. So I was like, would I like be able to wear this? Like, is it practical for where I live? So all of that thought made me think that I'm just going to repurpose this yarn for a different project. And I do have another project in mind, but it's going to be a while before I'm actually ready to start it. So I'm just going to keep that to myself for now. And then another reason why I'm kind of abandoning the Loveland shawl is because I picked this project so that I could learn several different Tunisian crochet skills at the same time. But now that Tony is having her holiday tea cow that I'm going to participate in, the shawl no longer serves its purpose. And so, sometimes projects just don't work out, and that's totally okay. You can totally use the yarn for something else. So no harm, no foul. I'm feeling good about it. But yeah, the Loveland shawl is done. It's gone. And so yeah, I'm gonna rewind this yarn because it was a pretty major frog. It looks like I'd already used about half of this skein. So yeah, and we're just gonna move on to a different project and work on different projects, and that is totally okay. All right, so the next project that I wanted to talk about was my traveling knit afghan that I'm working on. So if you're not aware, Lion Brand Yarn and Two of Wands are hosting this like year-long, it can either be a crochet along or a knit along. There's two different versions of the blanket. And essentially there's like 24, 25 designers involved with it. And every 2 weeks, the designer will design a square and then attach it to the blanket and then send the blanket on to the next designer. And it just goes on and on like that until you have a full blanket at the end of the year. So I am working on the knit version so that I can improve my knitting skills. And in episode 2 of the podcast, I talked a lot about the 5 squares that I had already completed to that point. So if you're interested, definitely be sure to check that out. So just for the sake of time, I'm going to start with the 6th square that I completed, which is square number, wait, I'm not holding this correctly. Square number 16 by 5410 Studio. So last week I was talking about how I was kind of hung up on this square because you can see that there are like 2 rows of knit 1 purl 1 ribbing between 2 rows of garter stitch, and those ribbing rows were really kind of taking me a while because I knit in the English style, so switching between knitting and purling can kind of be a lot at sometimes, and so it was just working up kind of slowly and I wasn't really feeling it, but I finally pushed through and got it done, and I actually really like how it looks. So, sometimes things that might not necessarily be that fun while you're doing them actually turn out to be a ton of fun. Ooh, that looks cozy. Yeah, it's like really squishy too. I really like it. So it was well worth the effort in the end, I think. I love that texture. Thanks. Like, me too. Like, it looks so nice. I honestly don't think that the camera is doing it justice, and now the lighting is jacked up. So, but yeah, it looks really nice, and I think it'll look really good with all of the other squares as well. So after I finished up square 16, I decided that I was going to attempt square number 2 by Nomad Stitches, and essentially I'm doing these squares all out of order because some of the squares have techniques that like I just felt very intimidated by. So I wanted to do some of the simpler squares first to kind of build confidence before I just jumped into doing something difficult. So square number 2 was one of those squares that was very scary to me. it was basically a lot of lace, so there were a lot of different increases and decreases, and I just wasn't really feeling it. But I keep a list on my phone of what order I'm going to do the squares in, and square number 2 is actually the next square up after square 16 for some reason. So I was like, okay, I have a little bit more knitting experience now, so I'm going to go ahead and give this a shot. So I attempted it, and I actually got pretty far into it, like a third of the way into it. I was very uncomfortable the entire time I was working on it. I had lifelines in like every 2 rows or so, because I was like, if I mess up on this, then I like don't know. I'm like not familiar enough with like knit stitch anatomy to be able to place a lifeline after the fact. Like I really like don't know what I'm doing. So I was being very cautious, and Nomad Stitches had a tutorial video up, so I was trying to follow along with that, but I still wasn't confident that I was actually doing things correctly, because like there was like one stitch in particular that like really didn't make sense to me. I think it was like slip purl. So if you're not familiar, slip purl is a type of decrease in knitting, and you like slip 2 stitches from one side to the up, like one needle to the other, and then slip them back onto the first needle. And that just really confused me, because I was like, why would you do that? But apparently it's because it like twists the stitches, and so it like makes the decrease lean a certain way. Like I have no idea what I'm talking about, honestly. So yeah, things like that were very confusing to me. But then I eventually got to like row 20, 21 or so out of 60 something. So like I said, I was about a third of the way into it. And I realized that like my stitch count was off. But I knew that a couple rows back it was correct. So I was like, okay, I'll just frog back a couple of rows. And the way that the pattern was written, it had you place some stitch markers kind of like among the first rows or something, and you kind of just kept like slipping the markers to kind of like keep your place. And so the way that the pattern was written, like instead of it being like, oh, like knit 15 stitches or something like that, it would be like knit to the marker. And so at this point I had no idea like how many stitches I was supposed to have between the markers, because we were like decreasing and increasing, and I just wasn't keeping track adequately. So to frog back a couple of rows to catch back up, I had to take the markers off. So then when I finally got back to the row that I was wanting to be on, I didn't know where to put the markers, because I wasn't sure how it was supposed to look. And so at that point I was like, okay, we're just going to try square 2 another time, because it was late at night, and I kind of just didn't feel like, spending the mental energy trying to figure out where the markers were supposed to go and where I was. So I was like, we're just going to push square number 2 down to the bottom of the list. So as of right now, it's the last square that I'm going to be doing out of the 24, unless another square also proves to be difficult. And we're just going to move on. I feel good. I feel like I gave it a good attempt. I didn't like just give up immediately, but I was kind of like, this isn't worth it. I could be working on something else. So it has something to do with the slant of the decrease. There are increases that way as well. Yeah, so slip purl, and yeah, so the pattern had like slip purl, slip knit, make one left, make one right, and I think that's it. So yeah, there were like quite a few different techniques being used at once, and I think I just kind of got overwhelmed. So lesson learned, and that square will get done eventually. I'm gonna do it eventually. It's just a matter of when, for sure. So anyway, once I frogged square 2, I decided to give square 3 a try, and square 3 is by the queen stitch. So this is what we're looking like so far. So essentially, this one's interesting because we're actually following a chart pattern. So like the most of the square is kind of in stockinette, and then there's reverse stockinette that's going to form a little crown. I guess because she's the queen stitch, she wanted her square to have a crown on it. So you can, I'm not like too far into like the crown design yet, but you can kind of see it coming together. And this is really rolling up since it's stockinette. But yeah, this one's a lot easier than square number 2, that's for sure. And reading the chart is interesting. I think the only reason why I skipped this square to begin with is because on the first stitch of each row, you slip the stitch to kind of get this nice edging. But when I was first starting on the traveling knit Afghan, I didn't really understand the difference between slipping knitwise and slipping purlwise. And so I was like, I'm just gonna skip this square. But yeah, that was the only technique that I wasn't sure of, but the rest of the square is super easy. And I think I'm doing the slip stitches correctly because this looks pretty good. And I imagine that having this type of edging would make the squares easier to seam together, but not all of the designers who are participating in the traveling knit Afghan are doing that edging. A lot of them are, but not all of them. So it'll definitely be interesting trying to seam those squares together for sure. So yeah, this one's working up pretty quickly and I really like it. So I'm glad that I just went ahead and moved on instead of dwelling on square number 2. All right, so then after I finish square number 3, the next one that's on my list is square number 4 by Knitbrooks. And that one's not looking too difficult. It looks like it's kind of worked on a bias, so like corner to corner instead of in rows. So that'll be interesting, getting some practice with doing increases. So that should be a good square to work on, but it's probably gonna be a minute before I actually get to start that one. All right. So I'm just moving right along through this. Let me grab some water. All right, so my next project, it's not a crochet or knitting or Tunisian crochet project. It is a resource that I'm working on, and it's right now it's called, I'm still not like completely sold on this title, but right now it's called the Crochet Pattern Skill Level Finder. And essentially it's a resource to help, it's mostly targeted towards designers who are trying to figure out what difficulty to rate their pattern, but I think I'm trying to design it so that it will be useful for anybody who might need it. There's basically like a list of criteria and there's like a point value assigned to each of them. And so there would be point ranges assigned to like each difficulty. So like beginner, easy, intermediate, advanced. So yeah, that one is definitely a slow burn. It's definitely taking me a while. But this past week, I have like a first draft of the quiz already. So I decided to kind of start going through some of like my patterns that I've designed and some of the patterns that I've made and filling out the, I guess, quiz for each one of those patterns, to try to see, how the quiz would work and like, wow. I'm sorry, I'm like really struggling today for some reason and trying to see like how the quiz would work and what changes would potentially need to be made before I actually send it out to testers. By the way, that nail color, oh my gosh, thanks so much. So I just got this week and I really like it too. I usually don't do colors like these, but I really like it. So this is an OPI polish and I don't remember what the color is called. It's something to do with geysers. It was like kind of a long title, but it's something to do with geysers. But yeah, I really like it. And I really like the finish on it too. It's kind of like a semi-matte instead of a shiny type of polish. So yeah, I am a fan. Thank you to whoever recommended OPI in my stories because I really like it. So yeah, I was going through some of my patterns, and I realized that I had a question on the quiz about how to, it was kind of like supposed to be addressing the size of the project. So I had a question on there that was like, does this pattern or project require more than one skein of yarn? Because I used my crochet skill level quiz as a starting point, and there was a question on that quiz about how to join a new skein of yarn. Like, do you know how to do that? And so I kind of just like changed the wording a little bit. So that's where that question originated from. So I was looking at one of my patterns, and I realized that depending on like the size of the skeins, that could be different, because I was thinking about my Drea drawstring bag in particular, and it uses like just over 50 grams of yarn. So the yarn that I used to make it came in 50-gram skeins. And so I technically did use 2 skeins of yarn, but technically if you had like 100-gram skein of yarn, you could do the entire thing in 1 skein and still have some stuff left over. So I was like, okay, I need to reword that question, I think. So then I kind of went down this rabbit hole. I went down a rabbit hole where I was like, okay, so I was kind of trying to figure out, what that question was getting at was like, what's the size of the project? And then I started thinking, well, how would you measure the size of the project? So then I posted a poll in my Instagram stories on Thursday with 4 different options on how you could potentially determine the size of a project. So the 4 options were by taking like the actual measurements or dimensions of the project, the time that it would take you to complete the project, the yardage of yarn that you would need to complete the project, and the number of skeins required to complete the project. So that was kind of like my original basis, the number of skeins that you would need. So the results were very close. So actual measurements technically won. It was 30.4% of the vote. Time to complete was 17.4%. Yardage required and number of skeins required were both tied. They got the same number of votes, and they were each 26.1%. So it was a very close poll, which wasn't really surprising because I was like conflicted on what you should be using, and that's like why I posted the poll to begin with, because I wanted other people's opinions. So it wasn't surprising to me that the poll was so close, but it also didn't really offer me a ton of clarity on how I should go about like addressing this on the crochet pattern skill level finder. So yeah, I have like a lot of thoughts on like each way that you can measure the size of the project. So I decided that rather than rambling on in my stories for like 20 different slides, it might be a little bit better for me to discuss it here in the podcast, especially since it actually is related to one of my projects. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. So as far as like the actual measurements of the projects go, I think that definitely makes sense, that one, because that's like the most obvious way. Like when you're talking about the size of the project, you're talking about like how large it is. But I don't think that it necessarily tells like the entire story, because obviously you can have like different stitches, right? And they would use like different amounts of yarn, and they would like maybe take less time or take more time or be more difficult. I think the example that I'm going to use throughout this is if you have something that's like solid double crochet swatch versus like a mesh swatch, like that mesh swatch is probably going to work up a little bit quicker than just your solid back and forth double crochet. but the mesh might be a little bit more difficult because you have to be aware of which stitches you're skipping. But then the solid double crochet swatch is going to use more yarn. So like, do you see what I mean? Just measuring the size of a project doesn't really tell the entire story, in my opinion, but I do still think it's important, and I understand why so many people were coming from that perspective. So the next one is the time to complete a project. So the reason why I even included that one on the poll to begin with is because that's actually something that I've been asked on a couple of pattern tests that I've done, like approximately how long did it take you to make this project? And I always thought it was interesting because I always kind of just guess on that, you know, based on approximately how much time I spend working on it per day. And I think it's a pretty accurate guess. Like, I'm not just making anything up. But I have honestly been thinking of ways to like measure how, like, A, how long it takes me to complete certain projects, and B, like how, like what's my rate of crochet, you know, like how many stitches per minute or per hour. And like, I don't know if anybody else would be interested in that, because like I'm a little bit of a nerd, and so things like that definitely interest me. But that's something that I've been like thinking about, like making some sort of resource for, like maybe like a log where it'll calculate for you. Like, I have no idea. I don't know. So that's just kind of my thought process behind that. But yeah, I think that the time that it takes to complete a project would be a good metric to measure the size of the project. But then a major flaw with it is that we all crochet at different speeds, and so that answer is going to vary from person to person. And you know, maybe it would be good to have like different ranges, like saying that like, oh, it'll take between 5 and 10 hours, instead of saying it's going to take 7 hours and 37 minutes, you know, having like a range to kind of account for those different speeds. But I don't know. It's just, I think that there might be a little too much variability in the time that it takes to complete a project, that it might not be worth including. So that's kind of just my thoughts on that. The next one, I guess I can talk about these next two together: the yardage required and the number of skeins required. So it was very interesting to me that these two tied. They got the exact same number of votes. So I thought that that was super interesting. But I think that the one that I'm leaning more towards is the yardage required, just because, like I kind of alluded to a few minutes ago, skeins all come in different sizes, right? So if a pattern says that you're going to need 4 100-gram skeins, then you would need 8 50-gram skeins, right? So technically it's more skeins, but it's the same amount of yarn, whereas the yardage would be the same always. So I think that, in my opinion, the yardage required is kind of a better metric than the number of skeins required. But I understand where people were coming from by saying the number of skeins required. So definitely interesting. And then the reason why I also prefer like the yardage required over like the actual physical dimensions of the project is because the yardage is definitely going to take into account different types of stitches. Like, there are some stitches that are yarn eaters and use a lot more yarn than other types of stitches, and so looking at the yardage is definitely going to take that into account. I'd love to know my rate of crochet. Okay, so I'm glad that I'm not the only one out there who thinks about things like that. So yeah, that might be something that I try to work on in the future. I have a lot of ideas, but it doesn't seem like a lot of time to implement them. So, but we'll see. I think that that's something that would be super interesting, because I want to know mine too, and maybe see how I can like get faster without hurting myself, of course, because I think that my speed has injured me in the past. So it's a very fine line to walk, for sure. So yeah, those poll results kind of got me to thinking about a couple of other questions. And if you're here watching live, I would love to know what you think. Or if you're like watching the replay, or like you just don't like know at the moment, you have to think about it. I probably will be asking these in my Instagram stories like later this weekend or next week. So definitely keep an eye out for that. I love talking to people and getting their opinions on things, and having these types of conversations really helps me when I'm developing resources like the crochet level. Ooh, wow. Okay. Like the crochet skill level quiz, and then like this resource that I'm developing for patterns. So definitely appreciate everybody's input. It's kind of like research, right? Because the reason why I'm creating these resources is because I've tried Googling them and I just wasn't satisfied with the information that I was finding, or lack thereof. So I really do kind of rely on y'all to give me your opinion so that I can form my own opinion and then put that into the resource. So anyway, so the two questions that I came up with was, one, do you think that the size of a project contributes to the overall difficulty of that project? Because I know that like a lot of people, I don't know if like intimidation is the right word, but I know people like prefer smaller projects. And I do think that there's like some sort of like psychological perspective that makes people think that a larger project is more difficult, but I feel like small projects can be difficult too. So yeah, that's the first question. Does the size of a project contribute to the overall difficulty? Second question is, if so, what do we consider to be like a small project or a medium project or a large project? So if you're talking in terms of like physical measurements, what are those measurements? If we're talking in terms of yardage, what is that yardage? If we're talking in terms of the time to complete, what is that hour range? So yeah, you can answer here, or I will probably have these questions up in my stories at some point, because I'm really curious to hear what people have to say. I have kind of an idea, but it's very tricky. So yeah, that's basically all the updates on the crochet pattern skill level finder. I don't want to like give too much away because I do want things to be a surprise whenever it's eventually released, but it definitely seems like it's a little slow going because I kind of need to come to a decision on everything I just talked about before I can like incorporate that into the resource and then test it out, and then I need to send it to other testers as well. So it's going to be a while before it's done, but talking about it here on the podcast definitely kind of helps me, like it keeps me accountable and it helps me to keep making progress on it. So because it had kind of just been sitting on my computer for a couple of months, so I'm glad that I'm making progress on it again. All right, it depends, I think, because you could have a large single crochet blanket or something similar. Yeah, that's true. That's true. Yeah. Because like if it's just single crochet, that's not necessarily difficult. I mean, I guess it might be a little difficult to make sure that you're keeping up with your stitch count, because I don't know about y'all, but like whenever the stitch counts get really large, I have a really hard time keeping track. Like anything, especially like at the beginning, like if it's something that like increases to have a larger stitch count, I don't have an issue with that. But if right off the bat it's like chain 357, I'm like, I don't know. I don't know. I'm gonna have trouble with that. So like with a single crochet blanket, you're working in rows. So I could see somebody like having issues with like keeping their edges straight. Like I know one of the first blankets that I made was kind of doing that little slant thing because I was not keeping up with my stitch count. So things to consider. I don't know if it would necessarily be easy, like if we compare a single crochet blanket to a single crochet washcloth, I don't know if one would necessarily be easier than the other. I'm thinking the washcloth would be easier, but this is why we have these conversations for sure. Oh yeah, lots of stitch markers help then. I use stitch markers every so many stitches to keep count. Yeah, I do the same thing. I mean, it depends on the size of the chain. So if it's something that's kind of between 100 and 200 stitches, I'll do every 20 stitches, because I think that's kind of like the length of my attention span. I can like count to 20 before I just completely zone out. But then if it's anything that's like a ton, like 300, 400, I'll do every 50, just because I like need to get more stitch markers. Like, I don't have a ton of stitch markers. I feel like I do, but they're lost. Does that happen to anybody else? Like, stitch markers just get up and walk away? Because I feel like I keep buying stitch markers and then I have 5. So, I don't know if that's just me. Yes, that slant. And I've heard placing stitch markers in the first and last stitches helps the slant. Yes, I could see that. Even like to this day, depending on the stitch, if it's something that's like kind of like, if it's just like a regular single crochet or half double or double, I can really tell the difference between like the starting chain and the actual stitch. But if it's something that's like a little bit more complex, I'll just go ahead and put a stitch marker in that first stitch anyway, just to be on the safe side. Let's see. Yes, I keep mine in a jar. Okay, so I'm glad that I'm not like the only one whose stitch markers seem to disappear. Keeping them in a jar is a really good idea. And I'm actually like mad at myself because literally the motivation behind designing my DREA'S drawstring bag was so that I would have a place to keep my stitch markers. And yet I keep losing them. So that's where we're at. That's how things go over here. I lose my hooks too, but I always find them eventually. So yeah. But yeah, these are just things to think about. I could honestly talk about this kind of stuff all day for sure. So yeah, just definitely keep an eye out for those questions in my stories within the next few days. And yeah, more to come on that resource. All right, so the last project that I had lined up to talk about today was my lattice lace dress by Stephanie Aaron. And this is Lion brand Kobu in the colorway silver, 2 different dye lots. If you want to know more about my opinion on the different dye lots, definitely check out episodes 1 and 2 because I talk about it a lot. So I'm going to try to talk about different things this time. So last week I mentioned that I had finally split the yoke for the sleeves, and I think I'd worked a couple of rounds into the body as well. And I tried it on, and I noticed that it was a little bit larger than it was supposed to be. This is supposed to be fitting with -1 to +1 inches of ease through the bust, and it's a dress, but I'm modifying it to be a peplum. Somewhat relevant, somewhat not. Anyway, so it's supposed to be pretty fitted through the bust, and I just, based on my size and like the final measurements of the garment, this is supposed to be fitting me with +1 inches of ease, so not as snug as it could be, but still pretty close to the body. So I had noticed last week that it was definitely fitting with more than 1 inch of ease. I don't know exactly, but it just didn't seem right. But I had double checked my stitch gauge, specifically my stitch gauge. Remember that, it's relevant later. I checked my stitch gauge, I checked the measurements, and it seemed like all was going well. So I was like, maybe once I get to the waist shaping, it'll like correct itself and fall correctly. But that's not entirely what happened. So I had to work a couple of inches on the body before I started to decrease for some waist shaping. And so I did a couple of rounds of the waist shaping and tried it on, and it was still fitting pretty large. Like you could kind of see that there was like a ton of excess fabric in the back, and I just couldn't figure out what was wrong. I was like, this isn't fitting correctly, but my gauge is correct, and like I don't know what's wrong. So I was just like racking my brain. I was like, is my stitch count off? So I counted my stitches, and it was off, but it was like too few stitches instead of too many stitches. So if anything, it should have been too tight. But then I remembered that I needed to check my row gauge. So I pulled out my tape measure, looked at my row gauge, and it was a row off. So instead of 16 rounds per 4 inches, it was 15 rounds per 4 inches. And that sounds like that doesn't really make that much of a difference, but over like 8 inches or 9 inches, it absolutely does. And so my armhole depth was about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch deeper than it was supposed to be. And so that's why the finished yoke wasn't hitting me at the right spot, and that's why it looked too loose. So instead of completely basically starting over in order to get that correct gauge, I decided that I was just going to frog a couple rows in the yoke, and then split for the yoke from there. And so that's what I did, and it is fitting a lot better now. So that was definitely the issue. And I'm definitely gonna try to keep an eye on the row gauge going forward. But at this point in the pattern, instead of working like a specific number of rounds, it's basically saying just work until you have like this measurement. So now the row gauge isn't going to be as essential as it was during the yoke. But yeah, lesson learned, definitely pay attention to both of your gauges, not just the stitch gauge, because this is only my second top-down garment. And the first top-down garment that I did was a pattern test, and my stitch gauge just went totally awry. So I was like pretty far into the garment, and I decided to completely frog and start over. And that was a very stressful situation, but it was worth it because the garment ended up fitting a lot better in the end. But since then I was like, I need to be like more mindful of my stitch gauge. So that was like the only thing I was paying attention to. But now I know that the row gauge is important too. So lesson learned for sure. So yeah, let's see. I had that issue too, that row gauge. Yeah, like nobody like talks about row gauge. We as a community do not talk about the row gauge enough. So there's that. So yeah, that's all the projects that I really had to talk about today. It seems like we are starting to get a little low on time anyway. Today I made sure that I didn't pull out every single project, because I think in the previous 2 episodes I was able to talk about like 5 or 6 projects within the hour. So I only pulled out my 5 projects, and so that seems like that was a good decision. So yeah, TL Yarn Crafts Tea-Cow Tunisian Crochet Along starts next Monday, so like 2 days from now. I'm so excited about it, and so I'm really excited to talk about that here on the podcast. It'll be interesting how I'm able to balance working on that and working on my other projects, because I really am going to try to keep up with the pace. She's releasing 4 squares per week, so I am really going to try to keep up with that pace. But I still want to work on some of these other projects too, because I know myself, and I know that if I just put these projects to the side for 6 weeks, I'm not going to be motivated to work on them after the Tea-Cow is over. So it's definitely going to be an interesting balance to strike. So last week in episode 2, I went over all the colors I'm using and everything. So definitely be sure to check check that out. I don't have them here with me. And yeah, next week we'll see how many squares that I was able to do. Let's see. That row gauge will definitely have you messed up. Definitely. Like, I don't know. I feel like I've been conditioned to pay more attention to the stitch gauge instead of the row gauge, because I've done so many patterns where it's like, if you can't meet both the stitch gauge and the row gauge, like prioritize the stitch gauge. And so I think I've been conditioned to think that the row gauge just isn't that important, but I was very wrong. And I saw a tutorial, or like maybe more of like an informational video a couple months ago about how you actually can, manipulate your, like the height of your stitches to change your row gauge. So basically like your yarn over loop, whatever loop that is, you can like pull it higher or lower, and that will change your row gauge. And so that might be something that I just have to practice, because I think I do kind of tend to pull up on that loop a little bit more as I'm crocheting. And so that's why my row gauge was smaller, therefore larger, than it was supposed to be on the lattice lace dress. So that's something that I probably need to practice and be more mindful of going forward. It seems if I have gauge issues, it's the row gauge. Yeah. I don't think I've ever actually met row gauge. Like, I know I met it on the lattice lace dress initially, but then like when I was working on the actual dress and just kind of like I was comfortable, you know, watching my podcast, watching the Golden Girls, just chilling, it really kind of loosened up. So I think my row gauge starts off okay, and then it just kind of like goes awry. Cute vest and lipstick. I never thought I could pull off a vest, but you've inspired me. Oh, thank you. Everybody can pull off vests. I love vests. So this was a pattern test that I did, I think like right before quarantine started, or maybe I was like finishing it up during the beginning of quarantine. But this is the Sweet Pea Vest by Crochet Creations. Crow, like CROW. And it's super cute. And I think the yarn that I used was Loops and Threads Cream Cotton. So 50% cotton, 50% acrylic, and it's super soft. And it actually goes down past my knees. It's not supposed to. For some reason, when I blocked it, it like really stretched out. But honestly, it's for the best. I kind of like this like long vest vibe that I've got going on. And then the lipstick is, I don't remember what brand it is. I don't remember if it's like, I know it's a drugstore brand. It's either Maybelline or L'Oreal. And now I'm gonna look it up. But it's like those lipsticks that smell like chocolate. I can't believe I'm looking this up right now. Ah, yes, it's L'Oreal, the Infallible Pro Matte Chocolate Scented Lipstick. And the color is 70% Yum. So I guess that's like a reference to like 70% dark chocolate or whatever. So anyway, all right. So I think I should probably start wrapping up now. I'm still like working on an outro. I think I've got the intro down, but the outro definitely needs a lot of work. But yeah, I'd totally be eating it, LOL. Yeah, like it doesn't really taste like chocolate. But it definitely smells like it. Like even now I can smell it because it's like right under my nose. But yeah, it smells really good. I like it. And like it stays put for the most part. Not as good as Beauty Bakery does. But still pretty good. And I really like the color too. So all is well. All right, so yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you were able to join me here live, thank you so much. I had a ton of fun, as always. If you're watching the replay on IGTV, I would absolutely love it if you were to give it a like, comment, and maybe share it to your stories if you've enjoyed it and you feel like it. It would really help me out a ton. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I would really, really appreciate if you were to like the video, comment on the video, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out a ton, and you would be the first to know when the video goes up. So episode 4 will be same time next Saturday. So Saturday, October 10th, live here on Instagram at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. The IGTV replay will be up shortly after that, and the YouTube replay will be up maybe later on Saturday, but probably Sunday if we're being honest. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope that y'all have a good rest of your week. No matter when you're watching that, I think that that's a valid statement to say that you have a good rest of your day and a good rest of your week. And I will talk to y'all next week. Happy making. Bye.